This invasion may have looked like just another raid, another clash between warriors, but it was not what people thought. For many across Europe, it felt like divine punishment, sent by God to punish the sins of Christianity. Chroniclers described it not as war, but as terror wrapped in human form. What rode across the land were not simply horsemen. To the people of the 10th century, they seemed like demons sent from the east, a storm that no prayer could stop. The Magyars, fierce warriors from the steppes, appeared suddenly and without mercy. They struck so fast and so often that villagers began to whisper they were not men at all, but agents of God's wrath. The story spread like wildfire. Monks wrote in their manuscripts that these raiders might be Gog and Magog, the apocalyptic forces mentioned in the Book of Revelation. Others said they were the devils of the wilderness called forth to test the faith of Christians. Either way, the meaning was clear. This was not just a threat to villages, farms, or cities. This was a threat to Christianity itself. For 60 years, the Magyars had been raiding across Europe. They came on horseback, moving faster than anyone had thought possible. They could strike in Italy one season, and the next they would appear deep in Germany or France. No wall, no castle, no holy place seemed safe. The terror was so complete that entire regions emptied. Peasants fled into forests. Fields went unplanted. Monasteries, which had been the centers of knowledge and learning, were abandoned or destroyed. Everywhere the Magyars rode, silence followed. The people believed this silence was more than human fear. They believed it was divine judgment. What else could explain it? How else could a people who had never known Christ tear through the strongest kingdoms of Europe without challenge? Priests began to preach that the sins of the nobility had brought this punishment. Lords who fought among themselves, kings who lived in excess, bishops who turned away from their duty, all had angered God. And so he had sent the Magyars, scourges from the east, to remind Europe of its weakness. The descriptions from chroniclers painted the same picture again and again. Imagine standing on the walls of your city, waiting, praying as riders appeared on the horizon. They did not walk slowly. They did not march in order like the armies you knew. They flew across the land on horseback, their arrows already in the air before you had time to gather courage. Their bows, crafted from horn, sinew, and wood, bent with incredible strength. A single pull could send an arrow straight through chainmail. European knights, wrapped in iron and pride, discovered to their horror that their armor was no more protection than cloth. Even worse than their skill was their cruelty. They did not only kill, they made death a warning. Captured nobles were humiliated, tortured, and often used for archery practice. Roads were lined with impaled prisoners, a corridor of agony that told every traveler what awaited them. Priests were burned alive inside their churches. Nuns suffered in ways the chroniclers refused to describe, writing only, "horrors that cannot be written." Sacred relics, the holiest symbols of Christian faith, were mocked. Communion wafers were thrown to horses. Oil meant for baptism and blessing was mixed with blood for pagan rituals. In one story, a bishop's skull became a drinking cup, raised high while the clergy were forced to watch. To the people of Europe, it was as if the very foundations of their world were shaking. For generations, the church had promised that Christ protected his flock. Yet every year the Magyars returned, burning, killing, desecrating. Each raid felt like proof that God had turned his face away. Peasants began to despair. Some even abandoned their faith, converting to the pagan beliefs of the raiders, convinced that Christian prayers had lost their power. Others whispered of the end of days, believing that Europe was about to be erased forever. The terror was not only physical, it was spiritual. Every night the survivors carried with them the same haunting question: had God abandoned them? Were the Magyars his chosen punishment, sent to destroy Christendom for its sins? The nobles felt this fear most of all. They were the ones accused of causing God's anger. Priests thundered in sermons that greedy lords and corrupt kings had brought doom upon all. Yet the nobles could do little to stop it. Armies were crushed. Castles were burned. Even the mightiest rulers trembled when the riders came. Conrad the Red, Duke of Lorraine, barely survived one such clash, his forces shattered. The thought that no one, not even the highest-born, could stand against the Magyars only deepened the sense that Europe's fate was sealed. Imagine being a child in this world. You would grow up never knowing peace. Your parents might tell you stories not of saints or kings, but of raids, fire, and terror. You might see the smoke of a burning village from your window and know instantly who had come. The Magyars were not just an enemy. They were a shadow hanging over every life, every prayer, every hope for tomorrow. By the year 955, this fear reached its breaking point. 3 generations had lived under Magyar terror. Entire families had vanished. Trade routes had collapsed. Learning had faded. As the monasteries that preserved books and history had become prime targets, the people no longer thought in terms of victory. They thought in terms of survival, or of simply enduring until the end of the world. It was in this moment, when despair threatened to consume everything, that one man stepped forward. Otto, Duke of Saxony and King of Germany, looked at the storm around him and understood what others feared to say aloud. If the Magyars were not stopped, Europe itself would die. Not just kingdoms, not just cities, but Christianity. The faith that bound the continent together would be torn apart. Otto saw what others had whispered but could not face. This was not just another raid. This was the end, unless someone turned the tide. And so in the summer of 955, Otto sent out his message, a call that echoed across Germany, Bohemia, Bavaria, and beyond. Unite or perish. Fight now or see the cross replaced with the darkness of the East. This was the line between life and death, between faith and despair, between the survival of Europe and its annihilation. The battle that followed would decide not just a kingdom, but an entire civilization. If the raids had been only about gold or land, Europe might have endured. Kingdoms had always risen and fallen, villages had always been burned, armies had always fought. But this was different. The Magyars were not raiders who came once and left. They returned again and again, year after year, season after season. They did not simply take, they destroyed. They broke the spirit of entire regions. They tore apart the foundation of Christian life. And that is why the stakes were so high. If they were not stopped, there would be no Europe left to save. Otto understood this better than anyone. By 955, he saw clearly that the Magyars were no longer acting like raiders looking for loot. They had become invaders. Their armies were larger, their weapons deadlier, their tactics more organized. They no longer struck quickly and retreated. Now they built siege engines, captured cities, and held territory. They were not content with plunder. They were preparing to stay. This was the turning point, and Otto knew it. If they established permanent rule in Bavaria or beyond, Christian Europe would not survive. Imagine what that would mean. For generations, the monasteries had preserved ancient books, writings from Rome and Greece, and the holy texts of Christianity. If the Magyars continued their destruction, those books would be gone, burned to ash, their knowledge lost forever. Trade routes that connected kingdoms would vanish, choking economies and starving towns. Children would grow up never learning to read or write, never knowing anything but fear. The great cathedrals and churches, the symbols of faith and art, would stand in ruins. The priests warned the people. If this invasion was not stopped, the entire faith itself would collapse. Christianity might fade away, replaced by pagan rites of blood and fire. It was more than politics. It was more than war. It was a battle for the soul of Europe. Every raid had already shown what the Magyars were capable of. They mocked holy relics, turning them into playthings. They desecrated churches, burning them with monks still inside. They humiliated priests, cut them down, or forced them to watch unspeakable acts. They made bishops' skulls into drinking cups. To ordinary believers, it was not just cruelty. It was proof that God had abandoned them. If God had not turned away, how could these horrors be allowed? But Otto saw something else. He did not believe God had left his people. He believed God was waiting, watching to see if his people would unite, and so he spoke with urgency. If this was not stopped now, if they failed to fight as one, there would be nothing left. Unite or perish. The stakes were not only spiritual. They were also practical, hard, and unavoidable. Europe's knights had trained for generations to fight in close combat, sword and lance against armored men. But none of that worked against the Magyars. How could you fight someone who never stood still, who never gave you the chance to strike? Their feigned retreat, pretending to flee in panic and then turning back to slaughter their pursuers, had broken army after army. Their arrows, shot while galloping at full speed, pierced armor and shields. Their mobility made them untouchable. If Europe could not find a way to stop this kind of warfare, then castles, knights, and armies meant nothing. By 955, everyone understood. If Otto failed, there would be no second chance. The Magyars would break through the heart of Germany, establish themselves as rulers, and from there, They would press outward. France, Italy, and the rest of Christendom would fall. It would not be the collapse of one kingdom, or even several. It would be the death of an entire civilization. And that thought weighed heavily. Europe had already suffered generations of fear. Entire families had been wiped out. Villages abandoned. Fields left empty. Starvation stalked the land because planting meant waiting in one place, and waiting in one place meant being easy prey. The population had shrunk. People whispered that the end of the world had come. If the Magyars were not, stop now, in 955, then there would be nothing left to rebuild. Otto's call went out, and for the first time in living memory, rivals answered together. Conrad the Red, once Otto's enemy, came with his cavalry. Dukes from Bavaria, Swabia, Franconia, and Bohemia sent troops. Even the elderly Bishop Ulrich of Augsburg, nearly 70 years old, put on armor and swore to defend Christendom. This was not just another war. It was the last chance. The people knew it too. The common folk who had seen their homes burned, their families slaughtered, prayed desperately that this time would be different. They prayed that God would finally answer. And Otto himself carried the holy lance, said to be the spear that pierced the side of Christ. To the soldiers, this relic was not just a weapon, it was a promise. If God had abandoned them before, perhaps he would return now. The stakes could not have been higher. If they won, Europe would have a future. The monasteries would survive. The faith would endure. Children would learn. Trade would flourish. And the continent would breathe again. If they lost, everything would vanish into darkness. The Magyars did not fear. They had never been defeated. For 60 years, every trick, every tactic, every raid had ended in their victory. They laughed at European armor, mocked European weapons, and trusted their horses and bows. To them, Otto's gathering was nothing, more than one more army to crush, one more pile of burning cities to leave behind. They believed their gods favored them, that no one could stand in their way. But Otto believed differently. He believed that God had chosen this moment, this battle, to decide between the cross and the pagan darkness. His men knew it too. On the night before the battle, they fasted, prayed, and waited. The air was heavy with silence, as if all of history was holding its breath. The stakes were clear. Tomorrow would not decide only who lived or who died. It would decide whether Christian Europe survived or whether it was erased forever. The Magyars were not like any enemy Europe had faced before. They were not bound by the rules of knights or the traditions of kings. They were horsemen of the steppe, trained from childhood to live and die in the saddle. Their power did not come from castles or heavy armor. It came from speed, discipline, and a way of life that had shaped them into perfect warriors long before they reached manhood. From the moment a Magyar boy could stand, he was placed on a horse. Byzantine writers who watched them with fear claimed these boys rode so much that their legs bent outward and their backs grew crooked. Whether that was true or not, it showed how Europe saw them, men who had become one with their horses, creatures half human, half beast, born for war. By their teenage years, these boys were already deadly soldiers. They could release a dozen arrows in a single minute while galloping at full speed. Their shots reached distances that no European archer could dream of, striking with force strong enough to pierce armor. Their bows were marvels of design, built from horn, sinew, and wood, compact but powerful. With draw weights reaching 150 pounds, a single shot could punch through chainmail as if it were cloth. The knights of Europe, who prided themselves on steel protection, found themselves bleeding beneath their armor, shocked that what had shielded them in other battles meant nothing against the Magyar bow. But skill with weapons was only part of their terror. It was their tactics that truly broke Europe. They refused to fight as knights expected. There was no honorable clash of sword against sword, no steady shield walls, no contests of strength. The Magyars fought with trickery, with speed, with endless patience. Their most feared tactic was the feigned retreat. In battle, they would appear to panic, turning and fleeing as if they had lost their courage. Enemies, thinking victory was close, would chase them eagerly, breaking their own formation. Then in a sudden turn the horsemen would wheel around raining arrows on the scattered pursuers, killing them one by one. Europe had no defense against it. Time and again entire armies were destroyed, not by brute force but by deception. Chroniclers wrote that the sun itself was darkened by their volleys of arrows, the air filled with the whistling of death. Men who had never seen such warfare before collapsed in terror, their courage stolen before swords had even clashed. And when the fighting ended, the true horror began. The Magyars were masters not only of war but of fear. They turned cruelty into a weapon as sharp as their bows. Noble children were sometimes captured and used for archery practice in view of their parents. Prisoners were flayed alive, their skins stretched and turned into banners waving above Magyar camps as symbols of triumph. Women who resisted were not simply killed, but mutilated, their fates recorded in whispers too terrible to write in detail. Along the roads, entire lines of captives were impaled on stakes, their screams echoing through the countryside as warnings to all who would resist. The shock of their appearance was enough to freeze whole towns. They scarred their faces in ritual, patterns shaved their heads except for stiff topknots hardened with animal fat, and decorated themselves with trophies of the dead. One of their commanders, Bulsu, wore a cloak made from human scalps, blonde, black, and red hair sewn together into a garment that rustled with every step. Another, Lehel, carried an ivory horn that legend claimed was filled with the blood of Christian princes. Before battles he would raise it and drink, mocking the faith of those he fought. To Christian Europe this was more than cruelty. It was blasphemy. The Magyars did not simply kill their enemies, they mocked their God. Monks were burned alive inside their churches. Nuns suffered what chroniclers called worse than martyrdom. Relics were desecrated, holy bread given to animals, sacred oil mixed with blood for shamanic rituals. In one tale, Magyar warriors used the skull of a bishop as a cup, drinking from it while forcing other priests to watch. It was not only war. It was humiliation, aimed directly at the heart of Christian faith. By the mid-10th century, this terror had become part of everyday life. For peasants, the sight of dust rising on the horizon meant death was near. For nobles, every call to arms carried the knowledge that defeat was almost certain. The Magyars were ghosts that could not be caught, demons that could not be stopped. Whole regions were abandoned as people fled into forests, leaving behind farms and churches to burn. Chroniclers recorded their despair. Some even claimed that peasants began abandoning Christianity altogether, choosing instead to worship the gods of the Magyars, believing their prayers offered real protection. And so the question lingered over every village, every church, every court. Were the Magyars human enemies, or were they instruments of divine wrath? Had God himself sent them to punish the sins of the people? For 60 years, no one could answer. Armies were crushed, cities looted, churches burned, and still the riders came back, faster, stronger, more merciless than before. By the year 954, their power had reached its height. Contemporary accounts spoke of an army of 100,000 riders sweeping across Bavaria, though historians believe the number was closer to 50,000. Still, it was massive compared to any force Europe could muster. They devastated cities, shattered armies, and brought terror to every corner of the land. Even Duke Conrad of Lorraine, a proud noble with a strong army, barely escaped alive after facing them. If men like him could be humbled, what hope did anyone else have? The Magyars had become more than a military threat. They were a nightmare that haunted Europe's every thought. For children, they were the monsters used to frighten them into obedience. For priests, they were living proof that sin had consequences. For nobles, they were an enemy who could not be defeated. Every year they returned, and every year Europe fell deeper into despair. This was the power of the Magyars, not only in their bows, not only in their horses, but in the fear they carried with them. They did not need to burn every town to destroy Europe. They only needed to ride, and already kingdoms trembled. By the middle of the 10th century, Europe had reached the breaking point. For 60 years the Magyars had burned, raided, and slaughtered. At first their attacks had been seen as a plague that would eventually pass. But as the years turned into decades, the truth became clear. This was not a passing terror. This was the new reality of Europe. And the longer it lasted, the deeper the wounds became. Generations had grown up knowing nothing but fear. Children had never seen peace. Their lullabies were the sound of hooves thundering in the night, the crack of fire consuming villages, the wails of the dying. Entire regions were emptied, as people abandoned their farms and towns to hide in forests and mountains. Trade had collapsed. Where once merchants carried goods across Europe, now the roads were silent. To travel was to invite death. The monasteries, which had been centers of faith and learning, were prime targets. The Magyars seemed to take delight in destroying them. Monks who copied sacred texts were killed. Libraries filled with ancient writings from Rome and Greece went up in flames. To many it seemed as if knowledge itself was being erased. Without the monasteries, without the books, without the scholars, Europe would sink into darkness. Theologians began to warn that perhaps this was the end of Christendom itself. Some priests claimed that the Magyars were Gog and Magog, the mysterious forces of destruction foretold in the Book of Revelation. Others preached that they were God's punishment for the corruption of nobles, kings, and bishops. The sins of the powerful, they said, had brought this storm upon the innocent, and so people whispered that God had abandoned them. Peasants began to despair. Some even turned to paganism, reasoning that the prayers of the Christians had failed while the gods of the Magyars seemed strong. By the year 954, the terror reached its highest point. That year, the Magyar leaders gathered the largest force Europe had ever seen. Some chroniclers claimed there were 100,000 riders. Even if the number was exaggerated, modern historians believe at least 50,000 warriors poured into Bavaria. This was no longer a raid. This was an invasion. Their leaders, Bulsu, Lahel, and Sur, meant not only to plunder but to conquer. This was their attempt to stay forever. The devastation was immense. They swept through Bavaria, ravaging towns and villages, leaving fire and death in their wake. They crossed the Rhine, plundered cities, and penetrated deep into Franconia. Duke Conrad of Lorraine tried to resist, but his army was shattered and he barely escaped with his life. His failure left all of Europe trembling. If Conrad could not stop them, who could? The situation was desperate. The people of Europe had been living in fear for so long that they no longer believed resistance was possible. Entire generations had grown up under Magyar terror. The thought of victory seemed impossible. But in the chaos, one man saw the truth clearly. Otto, Duke of Saxony and King of Germany, understood what was at stake. He knew that if the Magyars were not stopped now, if they managed to settle in Bavaria, then all of Christian Europe might vanish. Otto realized this was no longer about defending one kingdom. It was about saving an entire civilization. The raids had gone on long enough. Now the Magyars sought to root themselves in the heart of Europe. If they succeeded, the cross itself might fall, and pagan darkness would spread across the continent. Otto knew that this was the final moment. Europe could unite or it could perish, and so he sent his call. To every duke, every prince, every leader of the German lands, Otto's message rang out. Unite or all will be lost. He even called to those who had once been his enemies. The response was unlike anything seen before. Nobles who had fought against each other for years suddenly set aside their rivalries. Fear of the Magyars was greater than old grudges. Conrad the Red, Otto's former rival who had once rebelled against him, arrived with his Lorraine cavalry to fight at his side. The Swabians, Bavarians, and Franconians, ancient enemies who rarely cooperated, answered Otto's call. Even the Bohemians, who often tried to remain neutral, sent troops. For once, the divisions that had weakened Europe melted away. Even the church stood ready to fight. Bishop Ulrich of Augsburg, nearly 70 years old, put on armor and prepared to face the Magyars in battle. His presence was more than symbolic. It showed that this was not only a war of kings and dukes, but a war of faith. The survival of Christianity was at stake. In total, Otto gathered around 10,000 heavy cavalry, the largest German army in living memory. Against 50,000 Magyars, it might still seem hopeless. But for the first time in 60 years, Europe was united, and that unity gave them strength. The people, too, placed their hope in Otto. Survivors of raids prayed for him. Priests blessed his banners. Ordinary peasants looked to him as the one who might finally break the nightmare. And Otto did not come empty-handed. He carried with him the Holy Lance, the relic said to be the spear that had pierced Christ's side at the crucifixion. To his soldiers it was more than a relic. It was a sign that God had not abandoned them, that perhaps he had been waiting for this very moment. The Magyars prepared as well. Confident after decades of victory, they brought siege engines, siege tactics, and ruthless cruelty. They besieged Augsburg with ferocity, filling moats with the bodies of prisoners, catapulting severed heads over the walls, and roasting captives alive within sight of the defenders. Yet Augsburg held just long enough. As Otto's army approached, the Magyars lifted the siege and turned to face him. The stage was set. Two armies, one of the east and one of the west, stood ready. For the Magyars, it was the final step in their conquest of Europe. For Otto and his men, it was the last chance to save their civilization. On the morning of August 10th, 955, the fog rose from the Lech River, covering the battlefield in a thick white veil. To the Magyars, it seemed like a blessing. They had faced countless European armies before, and each one had fallen. Why should this be different? To Otto and his men, however, the mist felt like a sign that God himself was watching. The Magyars began with their usual strategy. From extreme range, their archers loosed wave after wave of arrows. The sky darkened as hundreds, then thousands of shafts filled the air. For 60 years, this storm of arrows had broken armies before battle had even begun. Soldiers usually panicked, scattered, and died in chaos. But this time, something strange happened. Otto's men did not move. They stood firm, their heavy shields raised, their discipline unshaken. The arrows rattled against steel and wood but failed to break their line. The Magyars grew restless. Their greatest weapon had failed. Still, they had another tactic, the feigned retreat. It was a trick that had destroyed countless foes. They broke their center, turned, and rode away in apparent panic. For 6 decades, European soldiers had always fallen for it. They would chase eagerly, hoping to finish the victory, only to be ambushed and destroyed when the Magyars turned and attacked from all sides. But Otto had studied them. He knew the trick, and he had warned his men. The German line stood still, silent and unshaken as the Magyar center fled. No one chased. The discipline held. And at that moment, the unthinkable happened. The Magyars' illusion of invincibility cracked. For the first time in living memory, their perfect tactic had failed. Otto seized the moment. He ordered his heavy cavalry forward, not in a reckless charge but in a controlled, steady advance. The armored knights, mocked for so long as slow and clumsy, pressed forward like a wall of iron. The Magyars loosed arrows again, but at close range the armor held. The knights moved through the storm step by step, horse by horse, until they closed the distance. Then with swords and lances they crashed into the Magyar line. The battle that followed was unlike anything the Magyars had faced. They were masters of movement, of circling, of ambush. But on this narrow plain between the river and the forest, Otto had chosen his ground well. There was little room to maneuver. Their light cavalry, so deadly in open space, found themselves trapped. The heavy cavalry pressed them back, their weight and discipline forcing the Magyars against the river. At that moment, Conrad the Red saw an opportunity. Once Otto's rival, he now sought redemption. Without waiting for orders, he led 1,000 of his Lorraine cavalry in a daring charge directly into the Magyar camp. They smashed through the reserves, cut down guards, and set fire to the tents. Smoke and flames rose into the sky. The Magyars turned and saw their camp burning, their slaves escaping, their loot scattered. Panic spread. What had always been their strength, the certainty of victory, was crumbling. Their arrows no longer killed. Their feigned retreat no longer fooled. And now their camp, the heart of their army, was in flames. Confidence turned to fear. Fear turned to flight. The battle became a slaughter. Pressed by Otto's advancing knights from the front and Conrad's raiders in the rear, the Magyars had nowhere to go but the river. Thousands tried to cross, but the weight of men and horses turned the fords into traps. Bodies piled up, damming the water. Chroniclers wrote that the Lech River ran red for 3 days. Those who made it across found no safety. Otto had stationed troops on the opposite bank. Exhausted, drenched, and scattered, the Magyars were cut down as they stumbled from the water. Conrad the Red did not live to see the victory. In his daring charge, he was struck in the throat by an arrow. He died as his men burned the Magyar camp, his sacrifice remembered as the moment that broke the enemy's spirit. For Otto, it was the perfect symbol. Even rivals had given their lives for the salvation of Europe. By nightfall, the field belonged to Otto. Chroniclers claimed 5,000 Magyars died in the fighting, with thousands more drowning in the river or hunted down in the days that followed. The leaders, Bolsu, Lehel, and Sur, managed to escape the battlefield, but they would not escape Otto's justice for long. For 60 years, Europe had lived in terror, and in a single day that terror ended. The Magyars, once the unstoppable riders of the East, had been broken. Their tactics had failed. Their courage had failed. Their gods had failed. The people of Europe, for the first time in 3 generations, looked at the East without fear. The chroniclers wrote that the victory was not just a triumph of arms, but a triumph of faith. Otto had carried the Holy Lance into battle, and the soldiers believed it had glowed with divine light. They sang hymns as they pressed their attack, convinced that Christ himself was with them. For 60 years they had asked if God had abandoned them. On the field of Lechfeld they received their answer. The battle was more than just a clash of armies. It was the moment Europe chose survival over despair. It was the moment knights, priests, and peasants realized that the terror could be stopped. And it was the moment Otto the Great earned his title, not just by leading men into battle, but by saving an entire civilization from annihilation. When the battle ended, the fields near the Lech River were filled with silence. The cries of the dying faded into the night. The smoke from the burning Magyar camp still drifted above the plain. The ground was soaked with blood, and the river itself carried the bodies of men and horses downstream. Europe had been living under terror for 60 years, but on that day it was over. The nightmare had ended. Otto did not let mercy weaken his victory. For decades, the Magyars had shown none, and now Otto gave them none in return. Those who survived the battlefield were hunted through the forests, cut down like wild animals. German peasants who had suffered raids all their lives needed no encouragement. They took vengeance with their own hands. The roads were filled with corpses left unburied, a warning to all who might try to invade again. The leaders of the Magyars, Bolsu, Lehel, and Sur, were captured not long after. Otto made a deliberate choice about their fate. In medieval Europe, noble enemies were often given honorable executions by sword. Otto refused them that dignity. Instead, he ordered them hanged, a punishment reserved for criminals and traitors. The scaffolds were built high, so crowds could watch the men who had terrified a continent meet their end. Bolsu, still wearing his cloak of human scalps, shouted curses against Christianity until the rope tightened around his neck. Lehel, the warlord with the ivory horn, left behind a legend. On the scaffold, he asked to blow his horn one final time. When granted the request, he struck Conrad of Franconia with it, cracking his skull. "You will go before me and prepare my way," he is said to have told him. Conrad died of his injury days later. The horn, still stained with blood, became a relic in Hungary, remembered for centuries. The executions were more than justice. They were a statement. For 60 years, the Magyars had humiliated Europe, mocking its faith, desecrating its holy places, torturing its people. Now the humiliation was returned. The message was clear. The era of terror was finished. The horrors uncovered in the aftermath shocked even hardened soldiers. In the Magyar camps, freed captives told their stories. Some had their eyes gouged out, tongues cut, or hamstrings severed so they could never run. Children showed scars from being used for archery practice, their bodies covered in wounds that had caused pain but not death. Women were found pregnant after months of captivity and abuse. Bishop Ulrich of Augsburg gave special permission for them to end their pregnancies, an almost unheard-of act in medieval Christianity, showing just how deep the wounds of Magyar cruelty ran. The victory at Lechfeld changed everything. The Magyars never raided Western Europe again. Their power was broken. Within a generation, they had abandoned their old way of life. They converted to Christianity, built churches, and established the Kingdom of Hungary. The irony was striking. Bolsu, who died cursing Christianity, would be remembered as the uncle of Stephen the Remafer, the first Christian king of Hungary and later a saint. The blood-drinking pagans became defenders of the same faith they had once mocked. For Otto, the victory transformed his destiny. He was no longer simply the king of Germany. He became Otto the Great. In 962, less than a decade after Lechfeld, Pope John X crowned him Holy Roman Emperor. His empire would last for centuries, shaping the future of Europe. Otto had not only saved his people, he had saved the civilization that would produce the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the Enlightenment. The battle also reshaped the way Europe fought. For centuries to come, heavy cavalry would dominate warfare. The knights, with their lances and armor, had proven at Lechfeld that discipline and courage could defeat mobility and trickery. The myth of Magyar invincibility was gone. The fear that had haunted Europe's knights had vanished with them, but the memory of their terror never disappeared. Chroniclers filled their pages with stories of the cruelty, the desecrations, the rivers of blood. Widukind of Corvey, writing after the battle, declared, "On this day Christ showed that he had not abandoned his people. The demons from the east were cast back into darkness. Churches across Europe rang their bells for 3 days in celebration. For peasants, it was as if a great weight had been lifted. Even centuries later, the battlefield was remembered. A chapel was built on the site where Otto had planted his standard. Each year on August 10th, people gathered to retell the story. Old women frightened children with tales of Bulksu's scalp cloak and Lehel's bloodstained horn, always ending with the victory that had saved Europe. Modern discoveries continued to confirm the scale of what happened. Archaeologists have uncovered mass graves near the battlefield, filled with skeletons showing brutal wounds, skulls split by axes, ribs pierced by spears, arrows still lodged in bone. Isotope tests proved these were Magyars, many already scarred from past battles, hardened raiders who had finally met their end. For historians, these graves are silent witnesses to the day Europe turned the tide. In Hungary, the story is remembered differently. Later chronicles portrayed the Magyars not as monsters, but as brave warriors defeated by overwhelming odds. The Lehel horn is displayed in Hungary as a national treasure. Some monuments honor Bulksu as a tragic hero rather than a villain. Nations choose their own legends, and for Hungary, the Magyars' courage mattered more than their cruelty. Yet the evidence, the burned churches, the mass graves, the abandoned villages across Europe, speaks louder than legend. For Europe, the meaning was clear. Without Otto's victory at Lechfeld, there might have been no Europe at all. The Renaissance, the art, the ideas, the discoveries, all of it depended on this survival. On that summer's day in 955, Europe chose life over annihilation. Today, the Lechfeld is peaceful farmland. Cows graze where knights and raiders once clashed. The river runs clear, not red, but legends remain. Some say that on foggy August mornings, the clash of steel and the cries of drowning men can still be heard. Others claim the ghost of Bulksu still wanders the field, his cloak of scalps rustling as he searches for lost glory. And in a museum, Lehel's horn still sits stained with blood, a reminder of a time when Europe nearly died, and of the battle that saved it. The Battle of Lechfeld did not end with the death of warriors or the burning of camps. Its echoes carried through centuries, shaping not only the history of Germany but the fate of all Europe. What had begun as a desperate defense against horsemen of the East became a turning point that ensured the survival of Christian civilization. For 60 years, Europe had known only fear. Villages were abandoned, monasteries burned. Children grew up believing that the Magyars could never be defeated. But on that day in 955, Otto proved otherwise. He showed that discipline, courage, and unity could break even the darkest terror. The victory at Lechfeld was not just a military success. It was a statement that Europe would not surrender to destruction. From that moment, the Magyars changed. Defeat forced them to abandon their old ways. Within a generation, they accepted Christianity and built a kingdom of their own. The same people who had once been seen as demons from the East became part of Europe's defense. Under King Stephen I, the nephew of the warlord Bulksu, Hungary became a Christian realm, later even producing saints. It was one of history's great ironies that the very people who had once desecrated churches would one day defend them. For Otto, the legacy was equally great. He was crowned Holy Roman Emperor in 962, founding an empire that lasted for centuries. Without his victory, there might never have been such an empire at all. His triumph at Lechfeld secured his title as Otto the Great. More importantly, it gave Europe a chance to breathe, to rebuild, and eventually to flourish. The consequences stretched far beyond his lifetime. Because the Magyars were stopped, monasteries could continue their work of copying and preserving ancient texts. Trade routes reopened. Farmers returned to their fields. The fragile structures of medieval society were no longer under constant threat of annihilation. In time, this stability allowed for the growth of learning, art, and discovery, the very foundations of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. Without Lechfeld, those achievements might never have been possible. Yet the memory of terror never fully faded. Chroniclers continued to write about the cruelty of the Magyars, about the scalp cloak of Bulk-Su, about the blood-stained horn of Lehel, about the rivers that ran red. These stories were retold generation after generation, warnings of what Europe had faced and what it had overcome. Children were frightened into obedience with tales of Magyar cruelty, but they were also reminded of Otto's victory, a proof that even the darkest night could end. Archaeology has given voice to the silence of those days. Graves uncovered near the battlefield reveal rows of skeletons, their bones marked by violence, skulls cleaved by axes, ribs pierced by spears, arrows still lodged in bone. These were not ordinary men. Many bore scars of old wounds, proof that they had fought in raid after raid, hardened veterans who finally met their end at Lechfeld. The ground itself still holds their story, silent witnesses to the clash that ended an age of fear. But Lechfeld is not remembered only through bones and chronicles. It is remembered through legend. For centuries, people in southern Germany gathered each year on August 10th to honor the battle. They built a chapel on the spot where Otto's standard had flown. Pilgrims came to pray not only for the souls of the dead but in thanksgiving for survival. Old women frightened children with tales of Bulk-Su's ghost wandering the fields, still wearing his cloak of scalps. Others whispered that Lehel's horn carried a curse forever stained with blood. Even today, the field is quiet farmland. Cows graze peacefully where thousands once fought and died. The river flows clear, its waters no longer choked with bodies. But on foggy mornings, some claim the air carries faint echoes, the sound of hooves, the clash of steel, the cries of drowning men. Whether imagination or memory, the land itself seems to remember. The legacy of Lechfeld was not only the defeat of an enemy, but the survival of a civilization. Without it, the Europe we know might never have existed. The Renaissance, the Reformation, the Enlightenment, all depended on the survival secured that day. The books preserved in monasteries, the trade that connected kingdoms, the knowledge that shaped the modern world, all of it could have been lost. Otto's men had fought not only for themselves, but for the future. Their courage ensured that Europe would not fall into darkness. It is easy to forget how close that darkness came. In 955, it was not certain that Christianity would survive. It was not certain that Europe would endure. Everything balanced on the outcome of one battle. The chronicler Widukind of Corvey summed it up best. On this day, Christ showed that he had not abandoned his people. The demons from the east were cast back into darkness. Those words captured the relief of a continent. For the first time in 3 generations, people believed that God had returned to them. Bells rang across Europe. Hymns were sung for 3 days. The nightmare was over. And yet, even in victory, the story was never simple. The Magyars, who had been feared as monsters, became Christian neighbors. Their descendants built a kingdom that defended Europe against later threats, including the Mongols. The blood of those who fought at Lechfeld flowed into the same stream of history that would shape modern nations. Enemies became allies. Terror became memory. The Battle of Lechfeld was not just about arrows, swords, or cavalry charges. It was about the survival of identity, faith, and culture. It was about whether Europe would vanish or endure. And because of Otto, it endured. Today the field lies quiet, but the memory lives on. In every church that still stands, in every book that survived, in every village rebuilt, there is a trace of Lechfeld's victory. The past speaks through the silence. It reminds us that history often turns on a single moment, a single battle, a single choice. In 955, on the banks of the Lech River, Europe chose survival.